Well, it's time now for Media Watch, and James Creedon joins me in the studio.
Hi, Belle.
Hi there, James. You've been looking into the fact that Xi Jinping, as we were just hearing there, has been potentially constitutional amendments have been made that might allow him to be president for life.
That's right. So a lot of reactions in the world's media. We'll start with the New York Times, Belle, and they're not mincing their words. They're calling it a power grab, even though it was the Communist Party that sort of announced it, not he himself. China joins a new era of strongmen. Now, that seems to be the opinion across the board to some extent. The Guardian today referred to him in their headline as the Putin of the East. Putin, I suppose, would be considered a strong man by most. Meanwhile, Quartz.com, Xi Jinping could now rule China for life, just what Deng Xiaoping tried to prevent. Now, they explained that there were sort of two transformational leaders in China since Mao Zedong, and one of them was Deng Xiaoping. And if you like, Xi and Deng Xiaoping, they kind of have headed in opposite directions in their approaches to power. And I suppose Xi Jinping is kind of, to some extent, sort of creating a bit of a personality cult, and it's less about collective rule and more about, I suppose, what would you say, a personality cult around his rule. Now, Forbes, in the meantime, has this kind of interesting fact. He was first elected in 2013. Now, there was a vote of 2,952 to 1. Now, they suspected that one vote against Xi's rule was actually by Xi himself, which would seem a little bit odd. But he may have cast the vote, as Forbes says, as a form of democratic window dressing. In other words, no, please don't vote me in for life, even though, or vote me into power, even though it's all probably been prearranged. But in any case, so there's clearly a certain amount of window dressing going on, but obviously he must be in favour of this in order to kind of go along with it.
To have put it forward, of course, is sort of an idea that perhaps, I don't want it, but I'll take it anyway. If you force me.
Humble. Exactly.
Well, so that's so much for the papers, as it were, the kind of traditional media. What about social media, which seems to have been a bit split about whether it's good or bad news?
That's right. Well, China observers outside of China seem to think it's bad news, and you can see here one such observer: seriously important and seriously bad news for China and the world. This means Xi Jinping is going all the way with the Leninist gamble, which has always failed in the past. Another comment similar, saying personalist regimes initiate more conflicts than do dictatorships based on institutionalized single parties. In other words, kind of the status quo up to now. Meanwhile, Chinese state media, they are really stressing what Xi Jinping himself was stressing, which is, of course, a lot of political communication, saying that the important role of the Constitution is to be borne in mind on Saturday, but actually they're changing the Constitution to allow this. So
the Constitution is clearly a movable feast. Anyway.
Right, there you go. No organisation or individual has the power to overstep the Constitution or the law, except perhaps oneself in changing it, right? And just one final element. This is taken from China's main social network, Weibo. Now, he is frequently compared, and the Chinese authorities don't like it, to Winnie the Pooh, because there might be certain kind of feature traits in similar. Could have expected this, but still pretty creative. First images of King Winnie surfacing on Weibo in response to Xi's potential indefinite rule. That sounds like a sort of jab to me.
Yes, it definitely...
Safe jab, you've got to be careful.
Well, yeah, because he's still a cuddly bear, isn't he? We're moving on to Slovakia next, where an investigative journalist has been killed, and that's drawn criticism from the EU.
That's right, in particular because he was investigating tax evasion at a very senior level in Slovakia. Now, it was a murder. He was shot in the chest, as was his fiancée, and his name was Jan Kuciak, 27 years old, working for a online newspaper called Actuality.sk. Now, it's drawn criticism across the board because it does seem to have been motivated by what he was investigating, and could have even involved senior politicians and whatnot. The EU cannot accept that a journalist is killed for doing his job. I call on the Slovak authorities to launch a thorough investigation with international support if needed. Now, this is the European Parliament President, the Italian Antonio Tajani. You also have the Vice President of the European Commission, who was tweeting that he was shocked by the murder. You have Reporters Sans Frontières, the French NGO, journalism NGO, saying that they are firmly condemning the murder of the journalist and his partner, and calling the authorities to bring those responsible to justice. And finally, Human Rights Watch, Andrew Strolin has been tweeting as well. You have images such as this, I suppose, showing the tentacles of, I suppose, crime syndicates or whatever around the Slovakian flag. And in fact, some pretty chilling details in that thread as well. The murderers placed bullets around the bodies as a warning to others who might think about investigating what Jan Kuciak was investigating. So there you go. It's beginning a lot
Very
of coverage
sinister,
because
yeah.
this is an EU country, and if we're seeing journalists and the free press being targeted in this way for investigating perfectly legitimate investigations into tax evasion, then it is somewhat concerning.
And echoes, of course, of the Maltese investigative journalist who was also killed under similar circumstances with also tax.
Exactly, and indeed
investigations.
Maltese MEPs tweeting as well about it today.
Absolutely, James. Thank you very much
Thanks, Belle.
for that wrap up of the media.